Welcome to this explainer. Okay, if you've spent literally any time studying the English language, you already know there's this one specific hurdle that trips up pretty much everyone. I'm talking, of course, about phrasal verbs, right? They often feel like this endless, chaotic list of just random word combinations that you have to brute force into your memory. But today, we're going to completely shift how you look at this. We're cracking the code on one of the most frustrating parts of learning English by revealing the hidden, structural logic behind it. Once you see the matrix of how these words actually work, you will absolutely never look at them the same way again. To get us started, I want you to think about a phrase you've probably heard a million times. Have you ever actually stopped to wonder why we use highly physical, spatial words, like the word in, to describe incredibly abstract emotional experiences? Like, why does bad news sink in? What is literally sinking? And into what? It's a fascinating quirk of the language, and it actually holds the key to mastering all of these tricky verbs.
All right, let's dive right in. The big secret here is that these prepositions, specifically words like on and in, they aren't just random pairings pulled out of thin air to torture language learners. They are deeply rooted in physical reality. Basically, the English language uses the geometry of the physical world as a metaphor for the psychological and abstract world. We use our everyday understanding of physical space to explain invisible concepts, like emotion, or continuation, or realization.
So let's look at Section 1, decoding the word on, and how it moves from the physical to the abstract.
Let's break down the mechanics of how we stretch a concept from the tangible, physical world straight into the psychological one. It's amazing how perfectly the physical act translates to the emotional one. Think about the literal physical meaning of trying on shoes to see if they fit. You're taking a physical object and placing it upon your body. It's an external thing you are wearing. Now, contrast that with a phrase from our source material about a character named Dan who is putting on a brave face. We're taking that exact same physical geometry, wearing something external, and applying it to an emotion. Dan is pretending to have a feeling that just isn't natural to him. He is literally wearing his bravery like a pair of shoes. It's a temporary outfit, not his true internal state.
And we can actually take this a step further and transform that physical action directly into an adjective. Take our source character Ben, who notes when describing someone whose happiness isn't genuine, I don't think his cheerfulness is put on. A put-on cheerfulness is just an artificial layer. It's a performance. Once you visualize the physical layering of clothing on a body, you instantly grasp the exact nuance of a put-on personality.
The truly crucial point here is that you can physically visualize these phrases. Listen to this quote from Sam. I've got something weighing on my mind at the moment. Imagine holding a really heavy rock. Now visualize that upsetting worry sitting heavy upon someone's actual thoughts. The word on gives the anxiety a physical location and a very real physical weight. It isn't just an abstract sadness. Actually, scratch that. It's not abstract at all. It is a burden actively pressing downward on the mind.
Moving to Section 2, beyond the physical, exploring the concepts of dependence and moving further.
Because on doesn't just stop at describing physical placement, right? It also governs some very specific, highly logical sub-rules in English grammar, like the idea of dependence. Just think about a building resting on its foundation. If you need to be completely confident that someone will help you, you use these verbs of dependence. You rely on Max, you depend on Max, or you count on Max. Max is the physical foundation holding you up. Without Max, you fall. The linguistic logic is perfectly consistent. And as a quick bonus tip from our sources, if you ever need to sort of elevate the formality of your writing, you can just swap in the word upon for these specific verbs. I depend upon Max carries the exact same spatial logic, just wearing a slightly more formal dress code.
Let's look at the second subrule and see how this builds the whole concept of continuation, or moving further. Our source gives a great example for this. Just because you failed one driving test, you mustn't stop having lessons. You must keep on trying. Or, when you're finished with a magazine, you pass it on to someone else. On, in this context, represents the geometry of forward momentum. It's a straight line pushing right into the future. You aren't stopping, you are continuing on.
All right, Section 3, decoding the word in and uncovering its spatial secret.
Now we're switching gears to how the physical act of entering, narrowing, or penetrating a space totally informs our vocabulary. And just notice the variety here. Whether it's a short visit into a town's boundary when you call in, or the literal narrowing of physical space by making a skirt smaller when we take it in, or even the physical friction of massaging a substance beneath the skin when we rub the cream in, what do they all share?
movement toward an interior. They all describe a transition from the outside world into a restricted internal space.
And this concept gets even clearer when we look at invisible barriers. Notice how the rigid physical barrier of being locked in an office building at 6:30 p.m. shares the exact same spatial DNA as rudely crossing the invisible social barrier of a bus stop line to push in. In both cases, a boundary is being defined. Someone is either trapped inside a boundary or aggressively forcing their way inside a boundary. It's all about the line between out and in. And that brings us right back to our opening question about the phrase sink in.
Let's put these two ideas side by side to see the absolute magic of this metaphor. On one hand, you have physical penetration, rubbing cream in so it goes beneath the surface of the skin. It requires time, friction, and absorption. On the other hand, you have psychological penetration, terrible news taking a long time to sink in. Once you picture the physical friction of rubbing that cream into your skin, it suddenly makes perfect logical sense why we describe the slow, really unpleasant realization of bad news as sinking in. The mind acts just like the skin. It doesn't absorb the shocking reality right away. The news sits on the surface, and it takes time and uncomfortable friction for that reality to actually penetrate the barrier of your understanding. It is just a stunningly accurate physical metaphor for a psychological process.
Which brings us to Section 4, Visualizing your vocabulary. Stop memorizing and start seeing.
Ultimately, what this explainer proves is that mastering these verbs is absolutely not about rote memorization. It's entirely about visualizing the physical space within the language. When you learn to see the invisible geometry of the words, they honestly stop being random rules and start being a cohesive, logical system. As we've seen decoded today from our source material, you do not have to blindly memorize a dictionary to achieve fluency. This structural breakdown shows us that grammar is basically just physics applied to vocabulary. When you understand the basic physical properties of on as an external layer or foundation and in as an internal penetration or boundary, you unlock the ability to intuitively guess the meanings of hundreds of phrases you've never even encountered before.
So, I want to leave you with a bit of a challenge for your own language journey. The next time you find yourself speaking or even just listening to an English conversation, pay close attention to the prepositions. Ask yourself, what invisible physical actions are shaping the words coming out of your mouth? Are you pushing against a barrier? Are you laying down a foundation? What other hidden physical meanings are lurking right there in your everyday vocabulary, just waiting to be visualized? Keep an eye out for that hidden logic, and your understanding will be deeper than ever. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.